asking Jean-Marc if he can speak a little bit more about the program in Casablanca at the Academy for Traditional Arts, and to ask specifically about the level of training that the students are getting, and whether that will be relevant, obviously, to the Moroccan architectural needs, but also if the students are being taught more broadly for working in other parts of the Islamic world. Jean-Marc?
Is it okay now? Yes. So it's a program of 3 years. A student have to be graduate. They have to be 2 years after the degree, and now and they have to choose one specialty. The first year, it was difficult to the selection of students was a little bit difficult for the first year. Mm-hmm. So the student was not very well prepared. But now it's better. For me, the problem is that students have to choose at the beginning to choose a specialty. And about what they learn about geometry, geometric art. It's not the main thing that they learned. I think they have to learn more geometry, but yeah. But it's difficult because the academy was launched by made by people on the top, people who don't know exactly the need of the student in that kind of art. But I hope things will change, will be better years after years.
And is there any emphasis to try and bring students from other countries, or is it really only for Moroccan students?
No, it's for Moroccan students. But I've talked to the authority of what is happening here in Istanbul, in the Istanbul Design Center, and I think they are open to share things, to do things together. Yeah.
Marvelous.
But it can takes long.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And Marek, could you tell us about your experience with the students in Dubai and in the Emirates? You worked there for a long time. And what is the program there? And is there an emphasis on Islamic geometric art and Islamic geometry?
There's absolutely nothing like this. Yes, there's nothing like this there. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that they don't have really people who can teach these things.
Yes.
So first of all, geometry is not a part of the university teaching.
Yes.
Geometry is evaporating from mathematics program. Mm-hmm. People talk about algebra, topology, and other things, and geometry is just squeezed into a corner and is quite often replaced by something else. Mm-hmm. So there's not background on geometry. There's also not many people who are able to teach Islamic design. There's even worse. You see, there's Islamic calligraphy. When I was talking to the people in Abu Dhabi, they told me the people who are doing the really good calligraphy, they are just dying. They are old people. And there's no replacement for them. Mm-hmm. So what the Emirati are doing, Emirati are just borrowing things from many other countries. Mm-hmm. From UK, from USA, from other places. They don't have really their own design centers. Mm-hmm. So that's what is happening there.
And did you have the sense that the students are interested?
The students are very much interested, but administration mostly is not.
Right, right.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Even in my university, you see, this is New York Institute of Technology, university having 7 campuses all over the world. Mm-hmm. Out of this, 3 campuses in Arab countries. They don't have a program on Islamic art.
Right.
They prefer to have programs on internet cybersecurity, or business management. They prefer to have things like this.
Yeah.
They don't think about Islamic art. They don't want to put a finger on this. I was suggesting this many times, and I never got any response from my administration.
Yeah.
Nothing.
And Carol, how about from your experience working in universities in the United States with the students there, have you felt that you're kind of working outside in terms of geometry and Islamic geometry, and specifically, are you working outside the norm? And if so, how do the administrations react, and how do the students react?
Oh boy,
Hit the red light there.
these are all tough questions.
Yeah.
I alluded to the fact that the study of Islamic art came late to the study of art history because Western art history privileged Western cultures. So the first obstacle that I experienced when I began was that Islamic art history was not really even considered a part of art history. So once one pushed that through, and that was as curator at the Textile Museum, there are many more positions now teaching Islamic art. As far as I know, I'm the only person teaching geometry in Islamic art. Do you know of others? And I would say I benefited from working full-time in a museum and teaching part-time in a university, because if I had a full-time teaching position in a university, I never would have been able to teach the courses I developed.
Yeah. And one of the things that I have thought over the years is that here in Turkey, the history of geometric ornament is amongst the most important and sophisticated in all of the Islamic world. Throughout Muslim cultures, the work that was done here in Turkey under the Seljuks in particular is of the highest caliber of geometric expression. Other cultures made beautiful things also, and also sometimes equaling the geometric sophistication, but no culture exceeded that of the Seljuk Turkish ornament. And it has always seemed to me that there should be more emphasis here in Turkey in the teaching of this, because it's a rare thing in the whole world, and yet it seems to be to some extent overlooked in its own backyard. And it's one of the things I admire so much about the Islamic Design Center, that what they're doing for the last 2 years, what they're doing in this program and last program, and hopefully into the future, is trying to bring emphasis here in Turkey to this wonderful heritage that really deserves to be recognized worldwide at a very premier level, because it is of a remarkable achievement, hundreds of years of remarkable work. Do any of you want to say more, or should I turn over for questions and answers?
I have one comment.
Yes, please.
Yeah, just in reflecting what you're saying and reflecting my comments on my students, I had many students at the Maryland Institute College of Art of Muslim heritage. So they live in the United States, but their heritage was Pakistan, India, Suriname, Turkey, countries of the Arab world, countries from the former Soviet Union. None of them, not a single one of them, had ever been exposed to or studied Islamic art. And they were richly excited by what they were learning in the study of Islamic art. But this is, how can one say it? This is a gap that has a long history. And although Orientalism and the study of Eastern cultures in Western cultures has often been criticized enormously, I think one of the great benefits is the growing cultural awareness of one's cultural heritage. And I think that the efforts that I have seen in the last 30 years in Turkey for historic preservation, for protection of cultural heritage and monuments, for the study of history of design, it's more focused on Ottoman than Seljuk, to be sure, but the training I've seen in architecture
really
schools is fantastic.
Yeah, and also to speak to the excellence of the work of Gülru Necipoglu at Harvard University and her research into the Topkapi Scroll and the book that ended in the publication, that culminated her research in her publication, the Topkapi Scroll. I'm sure many of you are aware of it. It's probably the very best book on the subject of cultural influences on geometric art that's available. I think it's an excellent book. And actually, speaking of publications, there are a number of really good books. I'll mention one to you all, and that is by a German scholar named Gerd Schneider. It's the German. I won't try to translate the German, but I'll only translate it. It is called Seljuk Geometric Ornament in Asia Minor, and it's very specifically the geometric patterns of Turkish Seljuk origin, and it's over 450 patterns, beautifully drawn by hand, not by computer, quite beautiful illustrations, and what's remarkable is that he identifies each pattern to its multiple locations, and so it's cross-referenced to pattern types and locations, and he doesn't go into an analysis of the methodologies. That's not his the function of the book, but in terms of a catalog of Seljuk geometric ornament, it's unsurpassed. It could never be surpassed. It's definitive. Remarkable book. Jean-Marc's book is a remarkable book as well. If you've not seen it, it's as detailed a book on the ornament of Nasrid and Marinid, and even pre-Nasrid and pre-Marinid designs of Spain and Morocco. An excellent book called Arabesques, and
Brugg.
Eric Berg's book, he was going to be here, unfortunately he is not. His book on geometric design is, his recent book is very, very good. It is his approach is more, as I was talking earlier, takes a more constructivist, step-by-step way of constructing patterns. That's an earlier book of his that's also really good. Yeah, that's a smaller book, and it's more concise with the examples given. His newer book, which is also excellent, it has more photographs in it and more historical information in it, but also has a lot of the step-by-step constructions in it. Those constructions, they're quite similar to the work of Assam al-Sayed that was done in the earlier, the 1970s, and was, yeah, this book you've got right here, the second one, yeah, that's Assam al-Sayed's book, and it's also really very good. You could hold it up to everybody if they would like to see it. This is, so these books have, Eric's book and Assam al-Sayed's books have a lot of step-by-step constructions for making existing patterns. They don't really help in providing information for creating new original patterns, and the patterns that are represented have to be less complex just by the nature of the methodology. It's not a particularly flexible method. It's not to say it's not traditional. There are more than one ways of making patterns. The way that Jean-Marc works is used in the Western regions. This more constructivist technique, I maintain, was used more by craftsmen to remake existing patterns. And then there's another methodology of using underlying tessellations that are like a scaffolding, like a building has a scaffolding when they're building it, and from that scaffolding you can use key points on the tessellation to create patterns. Would you like to talk about methodology at all, Jean-Marc?
No, just what I can say is that you are free to use any kind of methodology, and you can mix methodology.
Yeah, that's one of the beauties, is that there are not strict rules. It's inherently flexible. Are there questions from people that we could speak to? Yes, please.
I'm curious about the modern application of what's traditionally a religious artwork, and how often is it still used within a religious context, and how often is it now a secular art, and is there tension there, taking traditionally religious patterns and using them in secular ways, or what's the conversation happening about that?
I have thoughts on that, but would either?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, the question of religious symbolism or religious identification to geometric patterns specifically, but even Islamic ornament more generally, is one that is subject to debate. And people have differing ideas, and some are held more strongly. This idea more recently in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, was kind of popularized primarily with Keith Critchlow's work and S.H. Nasser's work, and where symbolisms were ascribed to specific geometric forms as universal, as examples of universal symbolism, kind of a perennialist idea where the number 5 always means one thing, the number 8 always means one thing. It usually harkens back to Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophical ideas. But the part of the problem with this is that there are no, correct me if I'm wrong, Carol, but there do not appear to be historical sources from historical Islamic sources for this kind of idea. So it's speculative, and I have, personally speaking, I have maintained that there is very likely symbolisms associated with artistic forms within particular groups active in the Islamic world at different times. Let's say, for example, a particular Sufi order, say, associated with Suhrawardi. Suhrawardi wrote a lot about the meaning of color, and to a lesser extent about numbers. And he gave symbolic importance to different kinds of colors. Well, then one can assume that those colors in those objects of art and those architectural buildings that are associated with him could very likely have those symbolic meanings because of the close association. But other Sufi leaders, for example, or writers would have other symbolisms associated with numbers. The number 9 meant one thing to one group and another thing to another group. So to create a universal symbolism doesn't seem to me to be so valid, but to do a thorough study of the architecture that's associated with one discipline that has numeric aspects to it, one mystical tradition within Islam that has numeric aspects, like Surawadi, for example, that would be very valid, but nobody's doing that. I don't know of anybody who's really done that.
Because there are no sources. Really.
There's so little sources.
Okay.
Yeah.
And even the Kirillov work, it is really based on the Western approach to the Western religions, okay, to the Catholic religion.
Yeah.
He's just transferring everything to Islam, but he has no reasons to do this.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would just add, I don't think it's only the lack of sources. There's definitely a lack of sources, but there's also a tremendous amount of work still to be done with the sources that we have.
No doubt.
And for example, Suhrawardi is really important as somebody who lived just before or at the same time as, but before Ibn Arabi. And Ibn Arabi brings together relationships of number and shape and space, but his work has not been studied in relation to the physical remains, the extant architecture. So that's just two examples, but I could probably name 5 or 6 more. There's a huge amount of work that needs to be done.
It's good for PhD focus.
I would say, in fact, nowadays, in Morocco, for example, where traditional art is still living, I think what is important, symbolism is not so important for the client. What is important is the price, because Islamic art is a market, and symbolism. Tradition is something important, but symbolism, I don't know. Something else, if you start working on that kind of shapes, after long, you will make your own symbolism. Yeah. But it's not a universal symbolism.
Yeah, I completely agree that if a person, any person, is inspired through their own sense of what gives shapes and forms meaning, and if it's always good to have a source of inspiration. And if that's an added source, then on a personal level, as Jean-Marc says, then that's valid. I wouldn't want to say that it's not valid, but as to reiterate what Marek was saying, that the concept of a universalist, one-size-fits-all kind of symbolism, there's no historical source for that, and so it's a well, spurious, I would just say.
Maybe there are some obvious things like 5. It's universal.
Except that for, this is the problem. Okay, 5. The Fatima and the Hamza, and on the one hand, but for Christians, it's the 5 wounds on the body of Christ. So it means Christ. It means the suffering of. It means different things for different cultures, and to give one, to sort of say, well, it means this, and that applies to everybody. It gets to be a problem.
But every human being have
yes, that's true.
5
or 10.
Or 10 sometimes.
But you say the 5 from mathematical point of view is the most interesting number, because it is, first of all, the most difficult to deal with the patterns based on 5 symmetry. 4, 2, 3, they are easier. 6 is easier. Then you're getting 7, which is quite difficult. And for this reason, you see there are very few ornaments based on 7.
No, very few.
Very few. Then you have 9, then you have 11. Again, a jump and something difficult. But 5 was the closest point, closest challenging point.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting because you mentioned in your talk Kepler, and if Kepler's worked with the pentagon and the decagon, and in his time in Europe, he was maybe the first to be working with these forms, but centuries earlier, 4 centuries earlier, the pentagon and the decagon were being used to create ornaments by the Muslims in Khorasan. The earliest fivefold pattern that I found is on the tower, the Ghaznavid Tower in Ghazni of Masud III, and there are two examples of fivefold patterns there that are absolutely beautiful, and these are the very earliest that I found, and they're, what is that, 11th century?
No.
Mm-hmm. Any more questions? Yes, please. Yes, please.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you very much for each of your talks. They were very interesting.
Thank you.
I have many questions, but I will stick with one. Anybody can answer this because you all touched on architecture so much. There were some interesting points, and for myself, I work in the field of Islamic architecture, if I can call it that. Mm-hmm. But the issue is, what I think we're unanimously agreeing on, is that the way things are moving forward, there is a need to understand this complex system, which has taken so much time to develop, and suddenly we are playing with it in such a way which isn't true to its original sources, right? So, as an architect, I can say that the problem we face is that the industry of architecture has developed in such a way, there's a replacement of stone, there's a replacement of brickwork, we now use metal and steel. For example, this building, though it's using woodwork, craftsmanship, it was a separate system. Today we're dealing with time constraints, we're dealing with clients who want the design done within a week, we're dealing with building construction, even how do we bring in craftsmen who can integrate with the design procedure. So what I'm asking is, how do you propose that the modern, it's the schooling which has to change, the schooling of architecture, or is it the built environment, or is it the philosophy of the way that we are seeing space and the city around us? So
yeah.
Maybe it's a big question.
Yeah, and it's a really good question, because in a way it goes to the heart of this discussion. And you're right that it's multifaceted. The problem is multifaceted. And one way I think that is important for architects to be able to incorporate elements that are more traditional in a more traditional way is through changing the educational architectural paradigm to once again include ornament. Since the modern movement, this is generally, not just for Islamic architecture, but generally, since the modern movement, the ornament in architecture has been cut from the curriculum. It used to be that architectural practices across the world had resident ornamentalists in their practice. Now it's completely different. Now when I introduce myself at some sort of meeting with a bunch of architects and I say I'm an architectural ornamentalist, they look at me and say, what is that? That's how far removed. Only a century ago, architectural ornament was taught at the universities, and every architectural practice of any size would have architectural ornamentalists working on their premises. So the modern movement has sort of stopped a whole discipline of artistic expression. So one thing that is needed is for architectural institutes and teaching facilities to reintroduce ornament as a valid exercise in its own right. Then more specifically to Islamic architecture, it just needs to be a more specific, more focused look on teaching Islamic design, including geometric design, so that people who are matriculating are well versed to be able to create patterns, incorporate them in ways that are meaningful, that are integral, as I was saying, integral with the form of the architectural itself. And I think it all comes down to training of people at the university level, I think is what it really, the crux of the matter. It's why I'm very interested in the program that's being taught in Morocco, and I know it's in its infancy. and it will probably change over time, and I hope that it will change. I personally hope that it will change in a way that emphasizes design, not just craftsmanship in different media, but emphasizes design and opens to a broader students, not just Moroccan students. And ideally, these programs need to look at modern ways of fabrication, not just traditional ways of fabrication. The best for me, speaking personally, and I'd like to turn over to Jean-Marc to speak to this too, because both he and I are it's part of our business, our profession is to work with architects on providing ornamental details for buildings. And so for me, the most satisfying projects are those that marry traditional work, be it in wood or stone, hand craftsmanship by excellent craftspeople around the world, that marry that with high technology, with CNC fabrication or water jet cutting or state-of-the-art casting. And in those ways, I think it's possible to elevate the modern architecture, especially modern Islamic architecture. Those are some ideas. Jean-Marc, could you talk to that?
Yes. I like to insist on the fact that in architecture, ornamentation and structure have to go together. And because until now, it's not in modern architecture, it's not the case. They build architecture, and after they say, we need some pattern here or there. It's not a good way to do. Architecture, that kind of ornamentation have to be made with the structure, because sometimes, as Jay said before, it's the ornament that will define some proportion in the architecture. Something else is to know, to learn patterns. It's something, but in architecture, it's not enough. What is missing is the knowledge of how to manage different kind of decoration within the same architecture. In the facade, for example, if I use can I use different patterns? Can I use floral? Can I use wood? And this knowledge is not taught anywhere, even in Morocco. And in Morocco, I insist they do something for that. Yeah. Because who know, just in terms of traditional art, who know that only craftsmen, the good craftsmen. And something is missing.
Yeah, something. Carol?
Yeah, I'd like to add to some of what Jay has said and reflect upon each of our presentations. One is there's a public component as well, and that is to counter the stereotyping of Islam that has emerged in the West, whether it's with Swiss minarets or headscarves in France, or Islamophobia, gigantic in the United States. And I would say probably more than half of my work week is devoted to breaking down stereotyping. And that stereotyping is what Mirak links stereotyping with ignorance. That stereotyping is what my colleague Mirak was talking about in terms of a mathematician asking about Islamic geometry and saying it's not geometry, or not even knowing that algebra evolved in the works of Al-Khwarizmi and influenced the history of mathematics. It's not a history of Islamic mathematics and Western mathematics. It is the history of mathematics. And that is not yet understood in the West. And that is something that I and my colleagues at the Graduate Theological Union are working at day after day after day, and it's step by step by step.
Very slow.
And after 9/11, 2001, that Islamophobia is growing rather than reducing. So countering ignorance
the
is a
ignorance.
big part of what
You
I
talk
feel
about
we have
history
to
of
do.
mathematics. You know, the history of mathematics that is taught in Europe, I don't know how it is in USA, but in Europe, it is Greek mathematics, and then mathematics, there's a gap, and then the mathematics starting from Fibonacci up. There's a gap in this, and nobody is touching this gap. Everybody is just avoiding in some way, and is just jumping to Fibonacci and great discovery of Fibonacci, which is very doubtful. Okay?
Well, and the dropping of geometry from core curriculum
yeah,
is
that's
something
another
that is
point.
shocking.
And that's
Okay.
worldwide.
That's
For
worldwide.
example,
Worldwide.
very important tiling theory, which was flourishing a few years ago. None of the universities is interested in teaching this. Nothing.
Interesting.
And
Nothing.
the third point that I wanted to mention is the importance in response to the question on architecture today and contemporary architecture, how rich an environment you all live in. Go out and explore and be in these monuments and just be there, get a sense of it. I so envy your being so close to historical monuments where you can really explore, examine, question, contemplate, reflect, and all of that will contribute to your own productivity.
That's nice. And any other questions, please? Did you have one? Yes, please.
İbrahim Çetin, Konya'dan katılıyorum. Selçuklu'nun kalbinden geliyorum. Necmettin Erbakan Üniversitesi'nde doktora öğrencisiyim aynı zamanda. Matematik öğretmeniyim. Doktoraya başlamadan önce Sayın Majewski'nin ATCM'de Asya Teknoloji Matematik Konferansı'ndaki sunumunu izlemiştim. Oradan esinlenerek doktora tezimi özellikle bu alanda yapmak istediğimde birçok danışman aradım kendime üniversitemde. Çok sayıda öneriler götürdüm. Özellikle şu an dünyada matematiksel anlamda trend olan işte bu bilimin, matematiğin, mühendisliğin ve fennin birlikte entegre edildiği sistem yaklaşımı vardı. Ben de buna alternatif olarak özellikle teknolojinin, tarihin ve matematiğin bir arada işlenerek böyle bir yaklaşımla çocuklara tarihin daha güzel verilebileceği konusunda böyle bir öneri getirmeye çalıştım. Üniversitede bilimsel araştırma projesi olarak teklifte bulundum, kabul edilmedi. TÜBİTAK'a başvurdum, kabul edilmedi. Erasmus projesine başvurdum, kabul edilmedi. Şu an son çarem yerel yönetim. Selçuklu Belediye'miz var. Bizim inşallah geldiğinizde de Konya'ya biz ziyaret edebilirsek çok güzel olur, destekleyeceklerini düşünüyorum. Bu anlamda son çarem Selçuklu Belediyesi kaldı. Bununla ilgili ne yapılabilir? Yani benim özellikle hani ne bir matematik gözüyle bakabiliyorsunuz, ne bir tarih gözüyle bakabiliyorsunuz, ne de hani böyle sanat gözüyle bakabiliyorsunuz. Üçünün kesişiminin ortasında gibi geliyor bana. Yani bu açıdan bunu geliştirmek amacıyla neler yapılabilir? Bunun hani Türkiye'de az önce hanımefendi de ifade etti ama maalesef biz sahip çıkmıyoruz kültürümüze. Bu konuda sizlerin önerisi nedir?
Well, I applaud what you're doing. That sounds wonderful, and it sounds like you are committed to not just a personal quest of knowledge, but then you want to be able to transfer that knowledge to, you want to be a teacher and to teach that knowledge yourself. And so I double applaud what you want to do, because that's exactly what we're talking about, what is needed. We need people internationally, especially from Muslim cultures, It's one thing for people like myself from the West to be interested in this, but what's really needed is for people in the countries of Islam to become more interested and to take the mantle as teachers to be able to teach within their own broad communities. And so I think that when you ask what you can do, I think you're already doing it from the sound of your question, that you're embarked on what exactly needs to be done, at least from my perspective. And the question of the source from which you are going to receive your degree from, which institutions. I am not familiar with Turkish institutions, I'm afraid to say, so I'm not, you're going to know much better than I, and maybe others here will know better than I. But it sounds that you have found, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you have found one source that can focus especially on Seljuk ornament and Seljuk design and Seljuk geometry. And if that is the case, then that's really excellent. And I'd like to know, and I'd like to have a conversation with you about this, because that's really my big interest. I am, for me, in my work, I have to create works that, architectural work that is relevant for the clients, and if the clients are in Saudi Arabia, it has to be relevant for them. But as a scholar and as someone who is inspired by Islamic design and ornament and architecture, it's the Seljuk work that particularly interests me more than any other. Its particular form of geometry and the quality of the stone ornaments. I just love this. That's my own preference. So I sympathize with your question very much.